Okay, we had a very lively session. It was led by Adrian. How do I advance the slides? Oh, this. Okay. And he started with a couple of slides, which I'll just summarize here. I should say that these cover all the issues I think we need to discuss, but we didn't discuss all of them. It was lively and ended up having its own focus. But the issues that we decided that the group should cover include these foundational ethical principles and objectives, identifiability and sensitivity of data, the recruitment process spanning different recruitment, different tissues, development stages, deceased donors, and so on. What are the minimal consent requirements for the HCA to enable data sharing, especially across international boundaries? And what are the sort of safeguards we need to put in place, these data access, privacy, security, and so on. The return of research results and incidental findings, something we didn't get to at all, withdrawal of consent, open data licensing and acknowledgement, diversity inclusion, and public engagement and involvement. So as I said, we didn't get to all of these, so I think we have the starting slides for the next session to continue with. But these are some of the questions we did address in the session, and they include what are the major regulatory and ethical stumbling blocks that exist right now? Are there best practices, and what are the available resources? What guidance and tools can the HCA support members who want to participate? And this was a particularly important topic for many that were in the room. And is this material different than any other genomic data sharing initiatives in terms of participants, identifiability, samples and sharing? It's not, but there is, as you've heard, more of a focus on open data access and fully sharing everything from raw data through, which makes it a little different or a little new for a lot of places. So our topic was dubbed, how do we do public access with a bit of baggage? That was Adrian's term, so I kept it up there because I thought it was a good summary for the session. And these are the kinds of issues that we ended up discussing. One of them was related to the open access and having clear consents and clear information about data use. So the group really wanted to know, are there example consents in use that permit broad sharing? What about the issues of commercial use? We had commercial groups in our session, and they wanted to know, would they be able to freely access the raw data just as anyone else would? And the answer in the room seemed to be yes, if it's fully open access, but what does that mean? How do people go about doing that? And then we had a discussion also about the issues surrounding data licensings for the HCA. What are data use issues there? How do we be sensitive to ethics and consent? And how do we deal with attribution of who generated the data and where the data and samples came from? So one of the other topics we discussed was that many of the samples are currently collected for specific research end goals. So over the course of this meeting, we've discussed samples from deceased donors, from pediatric collections, and from surgical biopsy and others. And particularly many of those sort of surgical and biopsy samples that are from living individuals or focused studies where people are studying the heart or some other organ. Many of those come from research projects that are established, and they have very specific research end goals. So there are lots in the room who are part of projects like that who really wanted to know, how do we best fit those goals to the sort of broader general goals of the HCA? There was also a discussion topic about deceased donors. In the US, deceased donors aren't human subjects, so nothing's needed. There was an example in Canada where the same had been said, but where is that really mentioned? You know, if that nothing's needed, who verifies that? Who says nothing's needed? And we got into a discussion there actually about the GTEx model where being a US collection where nothing was needed, we nevertheless decided to take the sort of high ground and make something needed. So a lot of the deceased donors who go for organ transplants do sign a document that allows research use, but it's very, very simple. So for GTEx, we actually put what we call a consent in place, which is an addendum to that, which specifically articulated that the data would be, we would generate genomic data, that it would be shared across international boundaries with commercial and academic entities and so on and so forth, and kept it to about 4 bullet points because those organ donors need to have very, very short consents. So we have that amendment there as an example, and in addition in that project, we actually did extend it to collect open access, fully open access data. And I've been working with ORIT. We've now taken that consent, we've modified it for a human cell atlas work, and it's currently undergoing IRB review right now, and is the kind of thing that we could share with people as a baseline. The other group we addressed were pediatric donors. There you have assent versus consent. You have parental oversight, and what happens there with future autonomy, and sort of decisions where a parent might say it's okay and overrule a child who says it's not okay. What do you do in that context? But what do you also do when the child reaches adulthood and decides they want to withdraw their own data? And what is the implications of that in the context of open access data where the data might have been downloaded many times? So there's issues with different countries, obviously, privacy issues and concerns varying. And then we touched on the engagement with participants, engaging everyone through from researchers to tech transfer lawyers, ethics boards, and subject and patient groups. One of the interesting things that came up was this issue about material transfer agreements. It wasn't on our horizon at all. We were considering ethical issues, consents in particular, but several groups brought up that to share samples and share data in a lot of academic settings requires material transfer agreements. That's a whole legal group to deal with. It's not the same as your ethics group. Every institution has their own, and they don't like to change their own. They like their own to be signed so that it doesn't have to go through another legal review. And right now we heard from at least 2 groups where this is slowing the ability to share samples with other groups for technology comparisons for single cell work, and it's slowing the collection of data and the ability to send them to places as well. So the MTAs were a whole issue that we sort of had to add to the agenda. So in terms of ethical guidance, tools and support to participate, what's available, the question that came up from the group was really, what do I need to do now? I'm ready now, there's an urgency, how can you help me right now? And how can I implement what I need right now, because I'm sitting here, I'm about to collect, but I don't know if I'm going to do it in the right way. So we had at least a couple of groups who are struggling right now to collect samples. They want to do it the right way, they want to be able to participate in the project, and they just need guidance and help. So that includes MTA constraints. A lot of those were the same. So what we really need is, to sort of clarify that, we need harmonization of some of these forms and clarity on what, the HCA might require or expect for groups that want to be part of it and join and contribute data. And we need that now. So this was sort of an action item that came out of this discussion and that I think the group as a whole thought would be very valuable is to gain some guidance from the HCA to help researchers who are looking to join right now. So can we create boilerplate documents that they can share with their ethics board, because this whole notion of open consent and broad data sharing is very new, as Mike just mentioned, and a lot of these boards haven't dealt with it before, and it's a scary thing. So can we come up with just a set of documents that are boilerplates that explain the project, that can serve as templates that people can adopt, and that includes consent examples, like the one that we've developed and used in GTEx, MTA examples, I haven't thought of those or looked at those, as well as help with public engagement, patient groups, and descriptions of the project for the lay community, because that helps researchers to describe the project to their community and to take the fear away from open access. So that's something that the group was really looking for right now. I'm not sure who the we is who can provide that, but I assume it's somewhere in this room. And then finally, is this really different from other materials, identifiability, participant samples, and sharing? So we heard from somebody representing the DCP about metadata. So they want to be broad and deep, but also inclusive. But that'll mean some of these are sparse and different. And they have a question about whether can all metadata be made available if it's very extensive. We had the example where something like gender, which is considered standard for most studies, could be an identifiable piece of information if combined with many other. And from my own experience, we actually had an article in Nature recently identify a handful of donors from GTEx by inadvertently providing too much metadata in just a sort of conversational summary. So it is possible to do that. But they wanted to know, will there be explicit description in the consents for the type of metadata that will be shared and how much? And if it's limited, what and what will that be, and will we expect it to differ by study and country, which I think everyone agreed we probably would. And then there was a group on how do we engage the public. Should we engage them at the consent stage, which becomes very different and country or regional specific, or later on? And, you know, what we really want to have this local engagement, but we also want to have these shared standards across these sort of documents. Could we consider community advisory boards? From our own experience, we had a very active sort of layperson side to GTEx, and that might be something to start at the very beginning here as well, it's very well received. One of the topics we actually didn't cover, but we touched on very briefly at the end, was this notion of broad use versus full open access. We ended up spending most of the time on this open access consent, but not the broad use, although in many respects, if consents, even if they're not open access, if they're not broad use and they have limited use, so they can't be used by a commercial entity, only academic, or they can only be used for this disease or that disease. In many respects, as we know historically, those are actually far more limiting. So restricted consents are far more limiting than non-open consents. So a non-open consent that's very broad and generalizable still has one barrier to get through to apply for the data, but then everyone can use it equally. And then we touched very briefly at the end, because we ran out of time, on this notion of open access versus population and geographical sampling. So we know from already doing it in GTEx that there's strong interest. People are very interested and will happily consent to open data access and sharing, especially if it's articulated very clearly. And we don't have a problem enrolling people. But that was one study done in the US, and we already know from doing an ethics study alongside that that the population that is willing to do that is only a subsection of the population. So we know that there are underrepresented communities, even in the US, in different countries, that aren't reached by that, that are potentially more fearful of that, and vulnerable populations. And so this notion of whether open access will work for everyone, even if it's a template, is something that we need to consider. And if we really want to do cross-population and geographical sampling, that may end up being a balance between open access and some considerations to privacy. And I think that was very much where we ended, so...
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kristen. I think in the interest, thank you. In the interest of everyone managing to get back for flights and things, we might not take any questions from this session, and if we have time at the end, I'm sure we could discuss after the final statements, if that